my trips the last 2 months has been only about this. I mean, there was a state visit here with Taiwan or whatever, but fundamentally, it's been about this issue. This is the singularly most important issue that we're having to deal with as heads of government right now. And the reason for that is because the solutions and the continuation of it are out of our control. As I said to somebody, we don't have the ability of picking up a phone and calling up God and saying, hey, we're not really ready. Can you hold off a couple of years until we get our act together? So many people accuse politicians of not being micro. So let me tell you the micro story here. And you started touching on it, Mr. President. The situation in Dominica is, if you're a business person, that the hurricane has happened, here's what you're facing. One, that you're not going to get the dollar value on your asset. So between depreciation and your what you call it, yeah, that you're going to get, if you're lucky, 80 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar, 60 cents on the dollar. And then when you get the money, it's down the road. It's not like somebody's going to come, you know, you see on TV where the State Farm guy comes and hands you the check. You know, as a car accident happens, that's just only on ads. It doesn't happen in reality. The next problem is the looting. So the businessman now has to pay for that looting himself. So if I'm going to rebuild under this new building code, the building I just got paid 80 cents or 70 cents on the dollar, I'm now going to have to spend $1.50 in order to rebuild properly. Okay? And by the way, I'm going to have to also now cover the cost for the looting because it's not covered in my insurance. So I have to absorb that. So once I'm faced with that dilemma, the next thing I have to turn around and say, okay, what is going to be my ROI? So in the case of Dominica, there is no business. The government is still operating out of the Prime Minister's office where the generator is. So 95% or 90% of the people, don't hold me to the number, still don't have electricity. All right? School is still not up and running because 80% of the people who've lost their homes, people are in the schools as shelters. So you have this dilemma, right? And then you have to ask the assets of the state. So the one tourism advantage that Dominica had was it was called the Nature Island. And so you have a situation now in which the entire rainforest is gone. In fact, all the trees, you saw a piece there where all the trees were like white, that's all you see. And so nobody's been able to make an assessment as to the extent of the damage of the rainforest and how long it's going to take to build back the rainforest. Because this is not something you can go to an aid agency and say, I want to buy a rainforest, right? This is all subject to time to be able to rebuild. So in essence, Dominica is having to completely rethink what its business plan is as a country. Because what it knew as business prior to the hurricane and what the reality is today is completely different. You know, Ross is not back open. Farmers are not producing. And then you made reference to the other fact is that we are in a very small ecosystem here in this region. So the solutions that were living in the Virgin Islands and the BVIs and the Puerto Ricos who were sending remittances back home are no longer doing that. And that also applies to Dominica. So all those Dominicans who are doing that, Dominica had really become the breadbasket of the Northern Islands. I mean, there were boats literally going every day and supplying fresh produce and ground provisions to the diaspora and to the hotel sectors. And those countries are gone. So there's no economy in St. Martin. There's no economy in the BVI. BVI is talking about possibly getting its hotel sector back up and running in 3 years' time, right? And the fact that I'm not hearing anything from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and we obviously see on TV still what's taking place in Puerto Rico, it's a daunting task, okay? So as a government, what we've recognized is that time is against us. Time is against us in that, one, who is covering the opportunity cost that's lost every day? So the businesses that are not operating, that aren't earning revenues, the farmers who are not selling stuff, the remittances that were supposed to be coming home, who's calculating that number? Right? And it's a big number. And it's not just for Dominica, but even the countries that have not been impacted, that opportunity cost lost is there. The second issue is migration. So what is happening in Dominica is that the people who can afford to leave are leaving. The people who can afford to leave the BVI are leaving. The people who can afford to leave the USVI are leaving. And some of them are coming here to St. Lucia, some are going to Antigua, and some are going further abroad. But they're leaving. And who are these people? These are the people like you on the board of directors of private companies, of government statutory bodies. These are your community leaders, your coaches. How do you replace that? Think of it. That's not something, again, that you can go and buy, that immediately you can do a course and teach a person those skills. Those skills are gone. And then the third thing that's impacting us, that's driving us, and why we're out on the road right now, is the next hurricane season is 9 months away. Okay, and we've heard all the numbers, and here's the scariest number of all, is that the agreement in Paris was to try to curtail global warming to less than 1.5. That's why it was 1.5 to survive was the cry. The recent studies are showing by 2030 that the temperatures are going to rise by 3.2%. And at the meeting that we had, the CCC, or 5 Cs, put together 50 scientists from this region and universities and showed what the impact is going to be. So at 1.5, it is pretty disastrous. At 2 degrees, you start getting a shift. And the shift that you start getting is that the rainfall is the same, but it becomes concentrated in small spaces. So it means that think of a Dominica that the rainforest has been devastated, and think that all of a sudden they go through a drought. In essence, what's going to happen is Dominica will become a desert. That's really what that is saying. And so the climate fluctuations, the water level rising at 2 degrees becomes where we're saying, and here's the word they're using, catastrophic. So far less when you start trying to contemplate in your mind 3.2. So as leaders in this region, what is it that we're confronted with? We're confronted with the fact that the SIDS, the small island developing states, of which there are 43 of them in the world, emit less than 0.5% of the carbon footprint. So if we were to emit 0, the impact that we would have on global warming is nothing. So in essence, that we are not in control of our own destiny when it comes to the word we call mitigation. So when I go to these meetings and people keep telling me about green energy and this and that, it is nothing. It's not going to solve our problem. So the question becomes, what is going to solve our problem? And it's exactly what is being recommended here, is that we have to build resilience to reduce the risk. That's what we have to do. And it becomes this word, and I think it's a daunting word, and everybody doesn't really understand what resilience building is. In the case of St. Lucia, resilience building is that we have to do slope stabilization. So you know the areas that are prone to landslides, you got to go in and terrace those spaces. Dominica has shown us, and the BVI has shown us, we have no choice but to put all of our utilities underground. That we have to now build bigger gullies. We have to now retrain our rivers. So you have to have now a shoulder for the river. You've also now got to raise the height of your bridges. And you've got to now do the resurfacing of your roads. And we've got to build now different shelters because we could no longer use the schools as our shelters. So we have to have dedicated shelters, so whether they are community centers or wherever else, but we cannot use our schools as the shelters. And that's not going to solve all the problem. But that is going to go a long ways, that if we get impacted by the hurricane, that we're going to get up on our feet much quicker. And the kind of catastrophic disasters we're seeing with the infrastructure and everything else gets resolved. Now that obviously includes the change in the building code, but that's on an individual basis that we have to make those changes. So here's the next dilemma. Where is the money going to come from to do that? Because we're literally being told by what I've just described to you, we have no choice but to do that. Have to go and spend that money. Now, when you're at 66% debt to GDP, when you're spending almost 23% of your budget on interest payments, when you've been running a deficit for close to 15 years, there is no fiscal space to go and spend the money. And if you do spend the money, the ROI on that investment is negligible. Because the ROI is a longer-term ROI, because what you're doing is really creating risk insurance, diminishing your risk insurance. So let me give you this example. Raising a bridge higher and it's carrying the same number of vehicles, there's no capacity change in your economy. Putting your utilities underground doesn't create any additional capacity change. There's no productivity gain that you're going to get immediately by making that investment. Putting bigger drains, resurfacing your existing roads, building new shelters, none of these things other than the employment it generates immediately, but there's not going to be a long-term economic impact on your economy. So we have been out arguing for four things. Number one, I'm glad Mr. McCready is here. The UK, when they tried to use what they call their ODA funds, their development funds, their aid funds, to assist the BVI and Anguilla, couldn't do it. Because both of those countries are middle-income countries and can't get concessional funds. And so I had the opportunity of meeting with Boris and with Priti Patel when we were in New York at the UN meetings. We were able to quickly confirm to them what the problem was and give them a solution. And the solution is that the OECD, we've been arguing for 15 years, this region and the SIDS around the world have been arguing for 15 years that we reclassified not on per capita GDP, but on vulnerability. And so Theresa May and Mr. Hammond went to the OECD meeting, I think it's about 2 weeks ago, and they were successful in getting the OECD to agree that they're going to go down that road. So at least we have the agreement now is to follow through to make sure that it happens. And so what that means is that as a developing country, as a SID country, we can access concessional funds. Still borrowing, but concessional. The second thing we said is we need money. So we just went to the meeting in New York, and unfortunately what we had predicted was going to happen happened. All the money that was being pledged was money for the countries that were being impacted. So the question becomes, so I have to get hit by a hurricane, be devastated in order to get money. And the quantum of money that they're giving them is only really to get back going, but it has no money to help build the resilience of the things I just spoke about. So what we're trying to do is to find the incentives to cause the bigger countries to agree to put monies specifically in an account for the SIDS. And we're also trying to create what we call a resilience bond and get the world to agree on incentives to cause the private sector to be able to put monies in. In fact, there's a meeting in Grenada with Richard Branson and Telsler and a bunch of people who are trying to come up with some ideas that's going to be taking place in Grenada. The third element is, how do we draw down on the money? So the British government, if I don't want to use them as an example, but I have to, gave the region around £360 million when Cameron was as Prime Minister to help us build infrastructure. And that's 3 years ago. And the only monies that have been drawn down on that fund has been consultancy monies. That's it. Right? Now, that's not a failure of DFID, that's a failure in my mind, and again, I say this and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, of CDB. Because what is happening is the countries, every different donor has a different application form. And I call it the moving shells. So if you apply for money on the DFID and you're not successful, the work that you did in preparing that project proposal can't be reused if you're now going to go to the EU or if you're going to go to a different donor agency. And so the bureaucratic process to be able to solve that problem, the protocols that are being put in place, are killing these small countries. We're already marginalized by our size and the lack of technical capacity, and it's being made even more complicated by the level of bureaucracy. The fourth thing that we've now said is that the IMF needs to work with us on how we're going to classify the borrowings for resilience. Because as I said to you, there is no fiscal space. And if I use the fiscal space, or we use the fiscal space, it's going to come at the expense of the hospitals and the schools and the existing roads and all the other expenditures you have. Because what it's going to do is it's going to increase the amount of debt that you have to GDP. It's going to increase your recurrent expenditures. Okay? And so there's no ability to borrow money to do anything else. And so therefore it becomes a nasty cycle in that your credit rating is going to go down, and then the debt you do have is going to go up in price because people are going to see it as being riskier. That's what we're facing. So we've said to the IMF, help us reclassify this debt. So this debt either has to be off the balance sheet item, so like a Marshall Plan, or amortize it over a longer period of time and only apply back a small portion every year. Now, we have not even begun to make the investment in resilience. And we're facing a calamity, because exactly what was being said is if we have one or more 2 seasons like this, there will be no insurance. And what's going to happen is your economy will continue to be degraded. So in essence, SIDS will become extinct. And I would say to you that in the case of Dominica, they have a very long road ahead for recovery. And if that happens in the BVI, and if that happens in Anguilla, and it happens in the other islands, it's then going to have economic implications on all of us. So I want to say to you that we are fighting very hard to get these issues resolved. It's not easy, but I can say to you that all the prime ministers of this region are on the same page. There is another meeting taking place in Paris in early December with Macron. And Mr. Macron has been really the one leader that is speaking this issue. Unfortunately, he's not speaking specifically to the SIDS. But what we've said to the world is the time has run out on the SIDS. And we need resolutions now. So we're trying to push very hard at the access to money, the protocols to draw down the funds, how we're going to classify the debts. We would like, before the first quarter of next year, to have those issues resolved, because we have to start spending money right now to be able to resolve the issue. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents to you, that this is probably singularly the most important thing. In terms of tourism, because we just came from the tourism meeting in Jamaica, is that we know exactly what's going to happen. The weather channels and the news channels by April of next year are going to be recanting the stories of last year, which potentially can impact your arrivals in the summer and the fall. So we're saying, if we know that, let's put together a regional marketing campaign. Let's put together a communication strategy to get out there and anticipate that. But you see, we are the ones paying the price. And we need to all work collectively together to make this big change. And the last piece that you brought up, Mr. President, is in terms of crisis management and planning. When 2 days before Irma, we realized that CDMA had done an amazing job of putting together disaster plans for each of the individual countries, but had not put together a well-coordinated plan for the region. So you had the perfect storm with 2 hurricanes, the traditional places that you would have gotten support from, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Miami, and that the backup to Miami was Houston, were all in jeopardy. So all of a sudden, St. Lucia, we had those meetings, and I want to again thank the Chamber for responding so quickly and so swiftly in terms of saying that St. Lucia had to become a point of extraction. And so that's why we dropped all the protocols. So the next problem that we've realized is that CDMA has no assets. There's no helicopter, there's no boats. So even in terms of trying to get the people out of Barbuda, eventually it was the Venezuelans who had to send planes up to make that happen. Luckily, when Irma came, we already were very active, and the Martinicans and the Trinidadians and the Jamaicans came to our support, and to your point, had things ready. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. This idea of declaring an emergency which then allows protocols to go in place. And I mean, I won't bore you with some of the stuff that we had to go through, but simply troops coming into St. Lucia bearing arms, okay, is illegal. Sniffer dogs would have to now have all the veterinarian shots and stuff like that. So the idea of by declaring a state of emergency takes away those protocols and allows those things to happen on a much substantive basis. But this is now the new normal. And I would say to all of you that we've got to work collectively together to be able to resolve these issues. Your government, as well as the other regional governments, are working very hard to get some of the bigger issues to resolve, which brings back the viability, the economic viability to your individual business. And I just want to really, the UK, I want to thank you very, very much for the support that we got from you. The French, you know, even with the Dutch were trying to resolve the problems in St. Martin from Curacao. And you know, the reason why, other than just being humanitarian in terms of offering to bring prisoners to St. Lucia, was to make the point that the solutions for emergency and how we're in recovery has to be here, can't be from abroad. So I suggest many of you go to Dominica, and once you've gone to Dominica, you will understand what I'm going to say to you now. There's two emotions that are driving me every day. Fear. Fear. Because that could have easily been St. Lucia, and I'm not so sure the outcome would have been much different than what you're seeing in Dominica. And the second one is helplessness. That not only are we being ravaged by the environment of which we are not the ones causing the problem, but secondly, the bureaucracy is stacked against us that we can't even help ourselves. So these are the things that we're facing. And again, I just want to thank all of you. And I'm sorry to have interrupted your meeting. I know I was long-winded, but I just wanted to share with you because I wanted to take this to the next level to let you know that we're all on the same page, and this is the #1 issue that we're facing today.